The morning mist clung to the Clearwater River like a shroud, and Marcus Thompson welcomed its embrace. 6:15 a.m., same as every day for the past 3 years. His boots made soft impressions in the damp earth as he followed the familiar trail. The only sounds accompanying him were the gentle rush of water over stones and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. This was his sanctuary, his temple of silence, where words were unnecessary and the weight of unspoken thoughts could finally rest. Marcus had learned to find solace in routine. Wake at 5:30, black coffee in the same chipped mug, check the weather through the kitchen window of his small cabin, then the walk, always the walk. The river had become his confessor, accepting his silence without judgment, never demanding explanations he couldn't provide. His therapist at the VA hospital had called it grounding, but Marcus knew it was simpler than that. It was survival. The scar tissue around his throat tingled in the cool morning air, a phantom reminder of the day his voice had died, along with his unit in that desert compound. Not from physical wounds, the doctors had explained with their clinical detachment, but from something deeper, something that had seized his vocal cords and locked them away like a vault that had lost its key. Psychological trauma, they called it. Marcus called it justice. A man who had failed to call out the warning that might have saved his brothers didn't deserve to speak again. But this morning, something was different. The river sang a discordant note, and Marcus's trained instincts, honed by years of combat and sharpened by months of hypervigilance, prickled along his spine. He paused, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where his sidearm would have been, before remembering he was no longer that man, no longer a soldier, just a broken remnant trying to piece together a life from the fragments of who he used to be. That's when he saw her. At first, Marcus thought it was debris caught in the shallow rapids where the river curved around the old stone bridge. But debris didn't wear a torn white dress, didn't have long, dark hair flowing like seaweed in the current. Debris didn't have pale fingers that clutched weakly at the smooth river stones, fighting against the gentle pull of the water that wanted to carry her away. His body moved before his mind could process the full weight of what he was seeing. Marcus plunged into the river without hesitation, the shock of cold water cutting through his morning calm like a blade. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at his legs as he fought his way toward the figure. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe mid-20s, with skin that had taken on the pallor of someone who had been in the water too long. A gash along her temple leaked a thin stream of blood that mixed with the river water, creating pink swirls that disappeared downstream. She was dying. Marcus had seen enough death to recognize its approach, the way it settled into a person's features like a familiar guest. Her breathing was shallow, irregular, and her lips had begun to take on that telltale blue tinge that meant her body was shutting down. But her eyes, when they fluttered open and met his, were still brilliantly alive. Brown eyes the color of rich earth, filled with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Marcus lifted her from the water, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the faint flutter of her pulse against his neck. She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly, and Marcus felt a sharp stab of irony. Here was someone who needed to communicate, who had words she was desperately trying to share, and he was the one person who couldn't offer her the comfort of his own voice in return. The walk back to his cabin felt like a march through enemy territory. Every step was measured, careful, as Marcus fought against the voice in his head that whispered it was too late, that he was carrying a corpse rather than a life worth saving. But her fingers, when they tightened weakly around the fabric of his shirt, told a different story. This woman was a fighter, and she wasn't ready to surrender. Marcus kicked open his front door, not caring about the scratches he left in the wood, and carried her directly to his bedroom. The room was sparse, military in its organization, but the bed was clean and the sheets were warm. He laid her down gently, noting the way her dress clung to her small frame, revealing a collection of bruises that spoke of violence, of someone who had been hurt deliberately and thoroughly. His hands shook as he reached for his cell phone, the one he kept charged but rarely used. 911. Three numbers that should have been simple, but Marcus hesitated. Involvement meant questions, meant explanations he couldn't provide, meant inserting himself into a story that would require him to speak. But as he looked at the woman on his bed, at the rise and fall of her chest that seemed to grow weaker with each breath, he knew he had no choice. The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, professional and demanding information Marcus couldn't provide. He hung up after managing to gasp out his address, hoping it would be enough. Then he sat beside the bed, watching over this stranger who had appeared in his life like a message in a bottle, carrying secrets he couldn't read and needing help he wasn't sure he knew how to give. In the distance, he could hear the first faint wail of sirens, growing louder as they wound their way up the mountain road toward his cabin. Soon, this quiet sanctuary would be filled with voices and questions and the chaos of people who lived in a world where words mattered. But for now, in these last moments of silence, Marcus found himself reaching out to touch the woman's hand, offering the only comfort he could give. Her fingers were cold, but when his skin touched hers, she squeezed back with surprising strength. And in that simple gesture, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. A connection that transcended words, a communication that spoke directly to the parts of him that had been silent for so long. This broken woman in his bed, this stranger who had literally flowed into his life on the current of the river, had somehow managed to do what dozens of therapists and doctors couldn't. She had made him feel human again. The woman had been unconscious for 18 hours when she first spoke his name. Marcus sat in the wooden chair beside his bed, the same position he'd maintained since the paramedics left, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest like a meditation. The EMTs had stabilized her, pumped her full of IV fluids and antibiotics, but they'd recommended the hospital. Marcus had shaken his head firmly, pointing to himself, then to her, then to the cabin. The lead paramedic, a weathered man named Joe, who'd seen enough mountain folk to understand the language of stubborn independence, had left medical supplies and strict instructions to call if her condition worsened. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of the space heater he'd dragged into the bedroom. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips moved with deliberate precision around his name, as if she were tasting it, testing its weight on her tongue. He leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. She couldn't know his name. He hadn't spoken it to the paramedics, hadn't written it down anywhere she could see, yet somehow, in the fevered landscape of her unconscious mind, she had found him. Marcus reached for the notebook he kept on his nightstand, the one he used for the rare occasions when gestures weren't enough, and wrote in careful block letters, "How do you know my name?" But she had slipped back into the deep sleep of the healing, leaving him alone with his questions and the growing certainty that this woman was not the random victim of circumstance he'd initially assumed. There was something intentional about her presence in his river, something that felt less like coincidence and more like destiny, arriving in the form of a broken bird. Dawn was breaking through the bedroom window when she finally opened her eyes fully. Marcus had dozed fitfully in his chair, his soldier's sleep that kept one ear tuned to danger, and he was instantly alert when her breathing pattern changed. She turned her head slowly, wincing at the movement, and those earth-brown eyes found his face with startling clarity. "You saved me," she said, her voice stronger now, though it carried the rasp of someone who had swallowed river water and screamed until her throat was raw. "Thank you." Marcus nodded, unsure of how to respond without words. He gestured to the glass of water on the nightstand, raising his eyebrows in question, and she smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, cautious and fragile, but it transformed her face completely. Even bruised and battered, she possessed a luminous quality that reminded Marcus of sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. "Yes, please," she whispered, and he helped her sit up, supporting her back with pillows while she sipped the water slowly. Her movements were deliberate, careful, like someone who had learned to navigate the world with a body that had been broken and was still learning to trust itself again. "I'm Elena," she said, setting the glass aside. "Elena Martinez. And you're Marcus Thompson, veteran of the 82nd Airborne, discharged 3 years ago after your unit was ambushed in Afghanistan." She paused, studying his face as shock registered in his features. "You've been living up here alone ever since, and you haven't spoken a word to anyone since the day you came home." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the panic that rose whenever someone probed too deeply into his past. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. How could she know these things? Had someone sent her? Was this some kind of VA intervention disguised as a rescue mission? "I know because I've been looking for you," Elena continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "Not in the way you're thinking. I'm not a therapist or a social worker or anyone official. I'm just someone who needed to find the man who saved my sister's life in Kandahar 5 years ago." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He turned from the window, his face pale, his hands trembling as the memories he'd kept locked away came flooding back. Kandahar. The little girl in the bombed-out school, no more than 7 years old, trapped under debris while enemy fire rained down around them. He'd crawled through the rubble, ignoring the bullets that chipped stone inches from his head, and carried her to safety. She'd been singing to herself a soft lullaby in Spanish, even as blood ran from a gash on her forehead. "Carmen," Elena whispered, reading the recognition in his eyes. "Her name is Carmen, and she's my little sister." She never stopped talking about the soldier who saved her, the one who didn't speak but who carried her like she was made of glass. She drew pictures of you, hundreds of them, and she sang that song you hummed to keep her calm. Marcus sank back into his chair, his world tilting on its axis. He remembered humming, remembered the melody that had come from somewhere deep inside him, something his mother had sung when he was Carmen's age. It had been the last sound he'd made before the explosion that killed his unit, before the silence claimed him. "She died last month," Elena continued, and Marcus felt his heart crack open like ice in spring. "Cancer. She was only 12, but she fought it for 2 years, and through all the treatments, all the pain, she kept asking me to find you. She wanted to thank you properly, wanted to sing for you the way you sang for her." Tears ran down Marcus's cheeks, the first he'd shed since coming home. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing away the moisture with a tenderness that undid something fundamental in his chest. Her touch was electric, sending shivers through his damaged nervous system, awakening parts of him he'd thought were dead. "I came here to fulfill her dying wish," Elena said, her own tears falling now. "I'm a music therapist, and I perform at hospitals and VA centers. I've been searching for you for months, following leads and checking records. When I finally found your address, I was so excited to meet you that I didn't pay attention to the warning signs. I didn't realize my ex-boyfriend had been following me." Marcus's expression darkened, his soldier's instinct sharpening as he processed this new information. He pointed to her bruises, then made a questioning gesture with his hands. "David," she said, understanding his unspoken question. "David Brennan. He's a police officer in Denver, and he's been stalking me since I left him 6 months ago. He found me at the gas station in town yesterday, and when I tried to run, he—" She touched the gash on her temple, her voice growing smaller. "He hit me with his baton, then dragged me to the river, said if he couldn't have me, no one could." Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had carried him through firefights and house-to-house searches. But this time, it was personal. This woman had come to him carrying a message from a little girl he'd never forgotten, and someone had tried to kill her for it. The universe had an ironic sense of humor, bringing him a victim to save when he'd failed to save the people who mattered most. Elena must have seen the change in his expression because she reached out, taking his hand in both of hers. "He thinks I'm dead," she said. "He threw me in the river and walked away, but I'm not dead, Marcus. I'm here, and I have something for you." She struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. From somewhere in the folds of her torn dress, she produced a small, waterproof pouch. With shaking fingers, she opened it and withdrew a piece of paper, carefully folded and protected in plastic. "Carmen wrote this for you," she said, unfolding the paper to reveal a child's drawing. It showed a soldier carrying a little girl, both of them surrounded by musical notes that flowed like water around their figures. At the bottom, in careful Spanish script, were the words, "Para el soldado que me enseñó a cantar en el silencio." Marcus stared at the drawing, his vision blurring as the full weight of Elena's journey hit him. This woman had risked everything to bring him a message from beyond the grave, had nearly died trying to complete a promise made to a dying child. And in saving her, he had unknowingly completed a circle that had been broken 5 years ago in a dusty Afghan schoolroom. "She wanted me to teach you something," Elena said, her voice growing stronger as she watched him study the drawing. "She said you gave her your voice when she was scared, so she wanted to give you yours back. She spent her last weeks composing a song for you, one that would help you find your way home." Elena shifted carefully, reaching for Marcus's hand and pressing it against her throat. "Feel," she whispered, and then she began to sing. The melody was simple but haunting, a lullaby that carried the weight of innocence and the strength of survival. It was the same tune Marcus had hummed in that schoolroom, but transformed, elevated into something that spoke directly to the wounded places in his soul. As Elena sang, Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of spring. The song was Carmen's gift, but Elena's voice was the key that unlocked it. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt his vocal cords responding, vibrating with the echo of the melody, even though no sound emerged. When Elena finished, the cabin fell silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant murmur of the river. Marcus looked at her, this broken woman who had traveled so far to heal his brokenness, and felt something he'd thought was lost forever: hope. 3 days passed like a carefully choreographed dance between two people learning each other's language. Elena grew stronger with each sunrise, her bruises fading from deep purple to yellow-green, and Marcus found himself anticipating her needs before she voiced them. He would appear with water before she felt thirsty, adjust the pillows before she shifted uncomfortably, and somehow always knew when the silence had stretched too long and she needed the comfort of human connection. On the 4th morning, Elena insisted on getting out of bed despite Marcus's protective hovering. She moved slowly, testing her balance like a newborn deer, but her determination was absolute. Marcus watched from the doorway as she made her way to the living room, taking in his sparse surroundings with the curious eye of someone trying to understand the man who lived here. The cabin was a study in controlled minimalism. Everything had its place, every surface was clean, and the only decorations were a few photographs of Marcus's unit and a purple heart mounted in a simple frame. But what caught Elena's attention was the old, upright piano tucked into the corner, its wood scarred and its keys yellowed with age. "You play?" she asked, running her fingers across the dusty fallboard. Marcus shook his head, then gestured to indicate that the piano had come with the cabin. He'd never touched it, had barely acknowledged its existence in the 3 years he'd lived here. Music belonged to a world where people spoke and sang and shared their hearts through melody, and Marcus had exiled himself from that world long ago. Elena lifted the fallboard anyway, revealing keys that were out of tune but still capable of producing sound. She pressed middle C experimentally, wincing slightly at the sharp pitch, then began to play a simple scale. Each note rang out in the cabin like a prayer, filling the space with something Marcus hadn't realized was missing. "Every voice is different," Elena said, her fingers moving across the keys in gentle patterns. "Some people think that losing your speaking voice means losing all voice, but that's not true. Music is older than words, more fundamental. It's the language the soul speaks when everything else fails." She began to play a melody Marcus didn't recognize, something flowing and peaceful that seemed to echo the rhythm of the river outside. As she played, she began to hum along, and Marcus felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the phantom vibration of vocal cords that remembered what it felt like to create sound. "Close your eyes," Elena said softly, never stopping her playing. "Don't think about speaking. Think about breathing. Think about the way air moves through your body, the way your heart beats, the way your blood flows. All of those are music, Marcus. Your body is an orchestra that never stops playing." Marcus found himself following her instructions, letting his eyes drift closed and focusing on the sensations she described. His breathing slowed, synchronized with her playing, and for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting against the silence. Instead, he was listening to it, hearing the subtle music that lived in the spaces between notes. "Now," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the piano, "just breathe out. Don't try to make words, don't try to sing. Just let the air carry whatever wants to come." Marcus exhaled slowly, and something miraculous happened. A sound emerged, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably vocal. It wasn't a word, or even a recognizable note, just the ghost of his voice testing the waters of possibility. Elena's playing never faltered, but he saw her smile, and that smile gave him the courage to try again. The second sound was stronger, more confident. By the third attempt, Marcus was producing a low hum that harmonized with Elena's melody. It was rough, unpracticed, but it was undeniably his voice returning from its long exile. They sat there for nearly an hour, creating a wordless conversation between piano and voice, between two damaged souls, learning to trust in healing. Marcus felt layers of ice beginning to melt, barriers he'd built around his heart starting to crumble under the gentle assault of Elena's patience and understanding. But their peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of a car door slamming outside. Marcus's eyes snapped open, his soldier's instincts immediately on high alert. He moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, and felt his blood turn to ice at what he saw. A black SUV sat in his driveway, its engine still running. A tall man in civilian clothes stood beside it, but Marcus recognized the bearing, the way he held himself with the confident aggression of someone accustomed to authority. This had to be David Brennan, and he was very much alive and very angry. Elena had gone pale at the sound of the car, her hands frozen above the piano keys. "He found me," she whispered, her voice filled with the terror of someone who had thought herself safe. "I don't understand how, but he found me." Marcus moved quickly, his military training taking over. He gestured for Elena to stay low and quiet, then retrieved the hunting rifle he kept in his bedroom closet. He'd hoped never to need a weapon again, but some habits died hard, and keeping himself prepared for threats was one of them. Through the window, Marcus watched as David approached the cabin with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the power. He was handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of smile that probably charmed juries and intimidated suspects. But Marcus had seen enough predators in his time to recognize the cold calculation behind those friendly features. David knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. "Elena!" he called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a concerned lover. "I know you're in there, baby. I've been so worried about you. We need to talk." Elena was shaking now, her entire body trembling with the memory of violence. Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes. Without words, he communicated his promise. She was safe here. He would protect her. David would not hurt her again. "Elena!" David's voice grew harder, more demanding. "Don't make this difficult. I just want to help you. You're obviously confused, probably have a head injury from your accident. Let me take you to a hospital, get you the help you need." Marcus felt Elena's grip tighten on his hands. Even injured and terrified, she was fighting, refusing to give in to the gaslighting and manipulation that had probably defined their relationship. She looked at Marcus with determination burning in her eyes and mouthed a single word: "No." The knocking stopped, and for a moment the cabin was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then they heard footsteps circling the building, David checking windows and looking for another way in. Marcus knew they had maybe minutes before the man's patience ran out, and he decided to force entry. Moving silently, Marcus positioned himself by the front door, rifle ready, but hoping not to need it. Elena crept to the piano bench, and in a move that surprised him, she began to play again. Not the gentle melody from before, but something stronger, more defiant. It was a song of resistance, a musical declaration that she would not be silenced or controlled. Her voice joined the piano, strong and clear despite her fear. She was singing in Spanish, the same language Carmen had used in her lullabies, and though Marcus couldn't understand the words, he felt their power. This was Elena reclaiming her voice, using music as both shield and weapon against the man who had tried to destroy her. David's reaction was immediate and violent. He began pounding on the door, shouting threats and demands, his mask of false concern finally slipping away to reveal the monster underneath. "Open this door, Elena! You're mine! Do you understand? You don't get to run away from me!" Marcus felt the familiar cold focus of combat settling over him. This was what he understood, what he was trained for, protecting the innocent from those who would do them harm. His voice might be broken, but his purpose was crystal clear. Elena's song grew louder, more powerful, as if she were drawing strength from the very act of being heard. And Marcus realized something profound. She wasn't just singing for herself. She was singing for him, giving him something to fight for beyond mere survival. She was offering him redemption wrapped in melody, a chance to save someone who mattered instead of failing again. When David finally kicked in the door, Marcus was ready, but more importantly, he was no longer silent. As the man burst into the cabin with fury in his eyes and violence in his heart, Marcus found his voice at last. Not in words, but in a roar of protective rage that had been building for 3 years. The sound that emerged from his throat was primal, wordless, but absolutely clear in its meaning. It said, "You will not hurt her, you will not take her, you have made a fatal mistake coming here." Elena's music continued, a soundtrack to the confrontation that was about to determine whether their fragile beginning would have a chance to become something more. In that moment, with her song filling the air and his voice finally finding its purpose, Marcus understood what Elena had been trying to teach him. Some things were worth breaking the silence for. David froze in the doorway, his confident aggression faltering at the unexpected sound of Marcus's roar. For a split second, predator became prey as he took in the sight of a trained soldier holding a rifle with the casual competence of someone who had used it before. Elena's music filled the tense silence, her fingers never stopping their defiant dance across the keys. "Easy there, mountain man," David said, raising his hands but keeping his tone condescending. "I'm a police officer. I'm just here to collect my girlfriend, who's obviously having some kind of breakdown." Marcus stepped forward, and David instinctively stepped back. The rifle remained pointed at the floor, but the threat was unmistakable. Marcus's throat worked, muscles straining against years of silence, and he managed to force out a single word that came out like gravel: "No." Elena's song shifted, becoming something Marcus recognized from his dreams. It was the melody he'd hummed to Carmen in that bombed-out school, transformed into something powerful and healing. As she played, memories flooded back with crystalline clarity. The weight of the little girl in his arms, the smell of dust and cordite, the sound of his own voice offering comfort in the darkness. "You don't understand," David continued, his police training making him assess the situation even as his rage simmered beneath the surface. "Elena's mentally unstable. She's been stalking some dead soldier, living in a fantasy. I'm trying to get her help." Marcus felt Elena's pain as if it were his own. He understood now why she'd risked everything to find him. Carmen's death had left her adrift, and completing her sister's final wish was the only way she could find peace. But this man had tried to destroy that mission, had nearly killed her for the crime of loving someone enough to honor their memory. The standoff stretched until Elena's voice joined her piano, singing in English now, so both men could understand. She sang about a little girl who drew pictures of angels, about a soldier who learned that heroes sometimes came in broken packages, about love that transcended death and connected souls across impossible distances. As she sang, Marcus felt his vocal cords responding, vibrating with phantom harmonies. David's face twisted with jealousy and confusion as he watched the wordless communication between Marcus and Elena, the way they seemed to understand each other despite his silence. "She's mine," David said, his mask finally slipping completely. "I've spent months tracking her down, and I'm not leaving without her." Marcus raised the rifle, his intention clear. Elena's music swelled, giving him strength, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger, more certain. "She stays." The two words cost him enormous effort, but they rang with absolute conviction. Elena smiled through her tears, still playing, still singing, still weaving the musical spell that was bringing Marcus back to the world of the living. David's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, and Marcus knew the moment of violence was finally upon them. But he was no longer the broken man who had pulled Elena from the river. He was a soldier with something worth protecting, and he would not fail again. The gunshot shattered Elena's song and the morning stillness like breaking glass. Marcus felt the bullet graze his shoulder, spinning him around as David's concealed weapon smoked in the cramped cabin. Elena screamed, her hands flying from the piano keys to her mouth in horror. Marcus hit the floor hard, his rifle clattering away, but his military training kicked in, even as blood soaked through his flannel shirt. David advanced with the cold confidence of someone who believed he'd neutralized the threat. His service weapon trained on Marcus's chest. "Now we can discuss this like civilized people," David said, his voice returning to that false calm that made Elena's skin crawl. "Elena, get your things. We're leaving." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She moved toward Marcus, but David swung his gun in her direction. "Don't move, don't even breathe wrong, or I'll put a bullet in your boyfriend's head." David's facade was completely gone now, revealing the monster that had hidden behind a badge and a charming smile. "You've caused me enough trouble, Elena. Cost me my job, my reputation. You're going to make it right." Marcus lay still, calculating angles and distances, waiting for the moment when David's attention would shift enough to give him an opening. Blood loss was making him dizzy, but he'd fought through worse injuries in Afghanistan. The difference was that this time he had something more valuable than his own life to protect. Elena's eyes met his, and in that moment, Marcus saw her make a decision that filled him with both pride and terror. She turned back to the piano and began to play again, her fingers finding the melody that had become their anthem. But this time, she sang different words, improvised lyrics that told David exactly what she thought of him and his threats. "You think you own me," she sang, her voice growing stronger with each note. "You think fear makes me yours, but you're wrong. You're nothing but a small, broken man who destroys beautiful things because you can't create them." David's face contorted with rage. "Shut up! Stop singing!" But Elena wouldn't stop. Her voice soared, filling the cabin with defiance and courage, and Marcus felt something extraordinary happening. His damaged vocal cords, inspired by her bravery, began to respond. Not with words, but with a harmony that rose from the deepest part of his soul. The sound that emerged from Marcus's throat was pure, powerful, and utterly unexpected. David spun toward him in shock, and in that instant of distraction, Marcus moved. 3 years of mountain living had kept him strong, and adrenaline masked the pain of his wound as he tackled David around the waist. They crashed into the wall, David's gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling. Marcus fought with the desperate fury of a man who had finally found something worth living for, while David struggled with the panic of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Elena's music never stopped, providing a soundtrack to the violence that would determine their future. And when Marcus finally managed to pin David to the floor, his voice broke through at last. "Elena!" he shouted, her name exploding from his lips like a prayer, like a declaration, like the first word of a man learning to live again. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the edge of the same river where he'd found Elena, but everything had changed. His voice, though still rough from years of silence, grew stronger each day. The words came slowly at first, like rusty machinery learning to move again, but Elena's patience was infinite. She had taught him that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, and some of the most beautiful songs were born from broken instruments. David Brennan was serving 15 years for assault, stalking, and attempted murder. The trial had been difficult for Elena, but Marcus had been beside her every day, his presence a silent fortress against the memories. When she testified, her voice never wavered. She had learned that her song was stronger than any man's attempt to silence it. The old piano had been tuned and restored, its keys now gleaming white and ivory under the cabin's warm lighting. Elena had moved in officially 3 months ago, transforming Marcus's sparse sanctuary into something that felt like home. Photographs of Carmen joined the military pictures on the walls, and the space hummed with the constant undercurrent of music and laughter. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, adjusting the microphone they'd set up beside the piano. Today was special. They were recording the song that had brought them together, the one Carmen had composed in her final weeks. Marcus had added his own verses, words that spoke of redemption and second chances, of love that could resurrect the dead parts of a person's soul. Marcus nodded, his hand finding hers as it always did when nerves threatened to overwhelm him. Speaking was still an act of courage, singing even more so, but Elena had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the birthplace of every meaningful connection. Elena's fingers found the opening chords, and Marcus felt that familiar stirring in his chest. But now, instead of fighting it, he welcomed it. His voice joined hers on the first verse, rusty but true, telling the story of a soldier who lost his voice to trauma and found it again through love. They sang about Carmen, about the river that had carried both death and rebirth, about the silence that had been broken by understanding. Elena's voice soared above his, weaving harmonies that spoke of hope and healing, while Marcus provided the steady bass notes of a man who had finally found his way home. When they finished, the cabin fell silent, except for the sound of the river outside, still flowing, still carrying its secrets toward the sea. Marcus looked at Elena, this woman who had literally flowed into his life, carrying messages from the dead, and spoke the words that came easier now than breathing. "I love you," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Thank you for teaching me how to sing again." Elena smiled, her fingers already finding the keys for another song. "Thank you for saving me," she replied. "In every way, a person can be saved." Outside, the river sang its eternal song, and inside the cabin, 2 broken souls had learned to make beautiful music together.